During the Cold War, countries were preparing for a nuclear disaster that never came. But the fear of such a catastrophe led to some interesting and often overlooked survival tactics. One of the most crucial problems they had to solve was keeping underground shelters dry, stable, and livable for extended periods. In this video, we'll explore one of the simplest yet most effective methods Cold War engineers used to protect their shelters from moisture, and why it still works today. We'll be talking about a survival hack that didn't require electricity, expensive materials, or high-tech gadgets, just basic physics and a little ingenuity. Let's dive into how Cold War engineers kept shelters dry, and how you can apply these lessons to your own off-grid or homestead projects. Now, let's talk about the real enemy of any underground shelter: moisture. Moisture is the #1 cause of shelter failure. Concrete walls crack, steel rusts, and all kinds of essential equipment like filters and generators stop working because of water infiltration. When it rains, water seeps into the ground and puts pressure on the shelter's walls. Condensation forms inside, and without proper ventilation, the interior becomes damp. This could lead to mold, mildew, and eventually structural damage. Even the best-built shelters couldn't fully prevent moisture from getting in. And with the Cold War tension, many of these shelters had to be maintained without the luxury of constant support or upkeep. But despite all these challenges, engineers found a way to protect these shelters from moisture, and it was surprisingly simple. The trick that Cold War engineers came up with was something remarkably simple: the controlled use of passive drainage and vapor buffering layers. What does that mean? Well, it's about guiding the water away from the shelter before it becomes a problem, instead of trying to fight it. Here's how it worked. Engineers installed thick layers of gravel, sand, or crushed volcanic rock around the shelter's outer walls and floors. These layers acted like a buffer zone, giving the water an easier path to travel than the walls themselves. The water would travel through the gravel rather than pushing into the shelter, where it could cause damage. The best part, this system didn't need any electricity, pumps, or complicated systems. It worked purely on gravity, guiding the water away from the shelter and allowing it to stay dry for years. And this method wasn't just theoretical, it was used in NATO command posts in Germany, Soviet bunkers in Eastern Europe, and American civil defense shelters in the mountains. So, how did they actually implement this system? Cold War engineers knew that moisture could be controlled long before it became a problem. They created what's called a drainage blanket, basically a thick layer of gravel, sand, or lime rock surrounding the shelter. This served as a physical barrier between the structure and the earth around it. But it didn't stop there. They also added a vapor buffering zone. This was a layer of material, like wooden planks or stones stacked in a way that created a small gap between the earth and the shelter wall. This wasn't a waterproof layer, was designed to absorb moisture and allow it to evaporate before it could reach the inside of the shelter. This might sound subtle, but it worked. Moisture doesn't always seep through. Cracks it can also travel through the tiny pores in concrete. By creating this buffering zone, they allowed the moisture to dissipate in the gravel layer, preventing it from sweating onto the interior walls during temperature fluctuations. This is exactly how they kept the insides of shelters dry enough to survive years of neglect. Now, you might be wondering, does this still work today? The answer is yes. The basic principles of passive drainage and vapor buffering haven't changed. Whether you're building a root cellar, storm shelter, or even a small off-grid pantry, this technique can still be applied to keep your structures dry. Here's how you can apply it in modern-day projects. First, when you're digging your shelter, make sure the excavation is wider than the structure itself. Then, backfill the area with a thick layer of coarse gravel or crushed stone. This will be your drainage layer. You want to make sure the water has a clear path to follow. Next, create a vapor buffering zone. This could be a layer of lime-washed wood or mineral-based sheeting. The goal is to have a breathable material between the gravel and the final wall structure. This simple step helps prevent humidity from building up inside your shelter. Lastly, you can take it a step further by shaping the gravel layer into a downward slope leading to a sump or an external drain. Even a simple slope can dramatically reduce groundwater pressure and help extend the life of your shelter for decades. Let's look at a couple of examples. If you're building a root cellar, you might see a lot of modern tutorials that rely on plastic liners to keep moisture out. But Cold War engineers would advise against that. Instead of trapping moisture, they guided it away. When building a root cellar, dig an extra foot or two around the perimeter and lay down a bed of crushed stone about 6 to 8 inches deep. This will act as your drainage layer. Then add another stone layer around the outside before refilling. Inside the cellar, install a lime-based plaster or treated wood buffer zone. This small addition can significantly reduce the humidity spikes that can ruin stored vegetables, jars, or tools. The same principle applies to storm shelters. Modern builders often assume that reinforcing steel and waterproof paint are enough. However, Cold War engineers would have insisted on adding a passive drainage layer to prevent water from seeping in. Keeping the shelter dry long after maintenance workers stopped visiting. One of the key lessons from Cold War engineers is that the simplest systems are often the most reliable. They didn't have fancy technology, but they had the wisdom to rely on gravity and basic physics. These engineers designed shelters that could survive without power, oversight, or replacement parts. What they left behind was a blueprint for creating structures that last. Whether it's a homestead cellar, a shed foundation, or a small safe room, this simple drainage and buffering method can make your shelter far more durable and long-lasting. So, if you're planning to build your own underground shelter or off-grid structure, remember that moisture control is critical. You don't need to rely on expensive technology or complicated systems. The Cold War engineers figured out how to keep shelters dry for decades with a few simple materials. Now you can too. I hope this video has been helpful, and if you found it valuable, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends who might be interested in survival, history, or off-grid living. Let's preserve these lessons from the past for the future. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.